Abandoned for years by her own family, an elderly woman receives a visit from someone claiming to be her grandson. But she never had grandchildren. Days later, a devastating discovery about the will makes her. Coraline Trask, seated in her favorite rocking chair by the window, contemplated the raindrops sliding down the glass in tortuous trails. The monotony of daily life in the nursing home was almost comforting in its predictability. The faint medicinal smell mixed with the scent of wilting flowers filled the air, a reminder of the constant cycle of life in that place. Coraline had grown accustomed to this slow rhythm. Since being taken to the home nearly 5 years ago, her routine was punctuated by lukewarm meals, occasional conversations with other residents, and the muffled sounds of footsteps in the hallways. On that day, however, something shattered the monotony. A knock at Coraline's door made her heart quicken slightly. It wasn't visiting hours, and rarely did anyone seek her out outside the usual times. Before she could respond, the door opened to reveal an unexpected figure. A young man with a serious and nervous demeanor entered with hesitant steps. He had dark, slightly tousled hair, a heavy coat soaked by the rain, and eyes that seemed to carry more weight than his age suggested. "Mrs. Coraline Trask?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Coraline narrowed her eyes, adjusting her thin glasses to scrutinize him better. "Yes, that's me. And you would be—" The young man took a deep breath, as if about to plunge into icy waters. "My name is Finian Darrow. I am your grandson." The air felt as though it had been sucked out of the room. Coraline didn't move, but her expression hardened slightly. The word grandson echoed in her mind, bringing uncomfortable memories of a past she had spent years trying to bury. "You must be mistaken, young man," she said with contained firmness. "I have no grandchildren. My son, he died a long time ago. He left no family." Finian stepped forward, pulling something from the pocket of his soaked coat. It was an old photograph, protected by a worn plastic covering. He extended his hand, offering the photo to Coraline. "I know it seems strange, but please look at this. It's of my father and Mr. Trask, your husband. I found it among his belongings." Reluctantly, Coraline took the photo, holding it with slightly trembling fingers. Her eyes fixed on the image. The faded photograph showed her late husband, Malcolm Trask, holding a small boy she recognized as her son, Anthony. The scene was unmistakable. The local park, the same place where so many happy memories had been made before everything fell apart. "This photo," Coraline murmured, unable to finish the sentence. Finian continued, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know it's hard to believe, but I know my father was Anthony Trask. He passed away before I could meet my family on that side. I grew up hearing about you, but I never knew where to find you. Until now." Coraline slowly returned the photo, as if handing over a part of herself. "Why now? Why after all this time do you show up here claiming to be my grandson?" "Because I could no longer ignore it," Finian replied, urgency rising in his voice. "I needed to find you. There are so many things I need to understand about what happened to our family." Coraline felt a mix of conflicting emotions bubbling within her: disbelief, confusion, and an unexpected twinge of hope. But something about the young man seemed genuine, even though her instincts told her not to trust completely. "You have much to explain, young man," she said, finally straightening in her chair, "and don't think I'll accept everything without questioning." Finian nodded, visibly relieved that she was at least willing to listen. He pulled up a chair and sat down across from her, like someone about to share a long-held secret. "My father, Anthony," he began, choosing his words carefully. "He was always very reserved about the past. He rarely talked about you or about Malcolm. All I knew were fragments, that you had drifted apart before I was born, that there were disagreements in the family, but he always kept a box with some photos and letters like this one." He gestured to the picture. Coraline listened in silence, her eyes fixed on Finian's face, searching for any trace of Anthony. For a moment, she almost saw her younger son in him, perhaps the shape of his eyes or the way he tilted his head while speaking. "You don't understand, young man," she interrupted, her voice trembling. I spent years trying to accept that my son was lost to me. He distanced himself, made choices I could never comprehend, and now you appear here, bringing it all back." "I understand how difficult this must be," Finian said softly, "but I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here because you are all that remains of our family." Finian's words hit Coraline like an unexpected wave. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the conflicting emotions that consumed her. "You said you found more than just this photo," she said finally. "Those letters, did you bring them?" Finian hesitated for a moment before opening his backpack and pulling out a small bundle of envelopes. They were yellowed with age, but Coraline's name was clearly written on them. "They're from my father," he said. "Letters he wrote to you but never sent." Coraline took the envelopes with careful fingers, holding them as if they were sacred relics. The silence that followed was laden with meaning as Coraline read the names on the letters, recognizing her son Anthony's familiar handwriting. "Why did he never send them?" she whispered, more to herself than to Finian. "I don't know," Finian answered honestly. "Maybe he wanted to, but something stopped him." Coraline looked at the young man before her, her eyes reflecting a mix of sadness and determination. "There's so much I don't know about what happened to him, to our family." Finian leaned in slightly, his expression sincere. "I don't know everything either, but I want to find out. And I think you are the only person who can help me piece it all together." For a moment, Coraline considered the possibility. Perhaps this young man was lying. Perhaps he had hidden intentions. But there was something in his demeanor, in his words, that felt genuine. And despite all her skepticism, she couldn't ignore the faint spark of hope he had ignited. "Let's start slowly, Finian," she said finally. "There's much to clarify, and while I'm not sure who you really are, I'm willing to listen." Finian smiled for the first time, a shy but genuine smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Coraline. I promise I won't let you down." As he settled into his chair, Coraline felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a small spark of life in her heart. Perhaps, just perhaps, the past she thought was lost forever could be revisited, and with it, some answers could finally be found. The sound of distant thunder filled the room, a reminder that the storm outside was still strong, but within Coraline, a different storm was beginning to form, a storm of memories, questions, and above all, hope. The sound of muffled voices in the hallway echoed through Coraline Trask's room, but she was not listening. Sitting in her armchair, her body still, her eyes were fixed on the sheet music Finian had left the night before. The notes handwritten by the son she hadn't seen in decades seemed alive, a fragile connection to a time she had avoided remembering. She tried to concentrate on the present, but memories came flooding in like an unexpected storm, inundating her mind with images from the past. It was a summer afternoon in Wisconsin, and the sound of Anthony's piano filled the simple, cozy house. Coraline remembered how he leaned over the keys, playing with intensity and passion, even with Malcolm sitting in the corner armchair, grumbling about how it was all a waste of time. "Anthony, why don't you go out and do something useful?" Malcolm said, rising with the stiffness that came from years of hard work at the local factory. "I like music, Dad. Why is that a problem?" Anthony retorted, his hands still hovering over the keys but not touching them. "Because liking music won't pay the bills. Do you think you can live on dreams? Wake up, kid." Coraline, standing in the kitchen doorway, watched the confrontation with a tight heart. Anthony was only 17 at the time, but he already showed the determination that made her so proud and that so irritated Malcolm. "Malcolm, leave him alone," she said, trying to dissipate the tension. "Leave him alone." Malcolm turned to her, his voice raised. "You always defend him, Coraline, always, but that only makes him weaker." "I'm just trying to give him a little freedom to discover who he is," Coraline replied, resolute. But even as she said that, she knew she was building a fragile bridge between father and son, a bridge that seemed destined to collapse. Back in the present, Coraline squeezed her eyes shut, as if she could push the pain of the memories away. The door to the room opened slowly, and Finian entered, holding 2 mugs of tea. "I brought this for you," he said, placing one of the mugs on the small table beside the armchair. Coraline accepted the tea but said nothing, still lost in thought. Finian noticed her hesitation. "You're thinking about him, aren't you?" he asked, pulling a chair to sit across from her. "It's hard not to think," Coraline replied, her voice hoarse. "These things you brought, they took me back to a place I've spent so long trying to forget." "Maybe you shouldn't forget," Finian said softly. Coraline looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and curiosity. "And what do you know about forgetting, boy? You're young. You have no idea what it means to lose someone so completely that not even memory feels sufficient to bring them back." Finian hesitated, clearly pondering how to respond. He placed the tea mug on the table and took a deep breath. "My dad also tried to forget. He never talked much about you or Malcolm, but I knew there was something heavy there. He had a way of changing the subject whenever I asked, as if he was afraid to remember." "Anthony was always like that," Coraline replied, more to herself than to Finian. "He kept everything inside. Even when he was a child, he preferred to deal with things on his own. I thought he would overcome it with time, but maybe I was wrong." Finian leaned slightly forward, his expression a mix of compassion and determination. "You said yesterday that he left, that he wrote a note. What did it say exactly?" Coraline fell silent for a moment, her fingers slowly tracing the rim of the mug. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and controlled. "He said he needed to find his own way, that he could no longer live under his father's expectations. But he also blamed me. He said I never truly defended him, that I always tried to appease both sides instead of really choosing one. And maybe he was right." Finian frowned, trying to process her words. "And you never heard from him after that?" "No," Coraline replied, shaking her head. "I waited. For months I waited for him to come back, to call, to at least write to me, but silence was all I received." "He came back," Finian said, almost in a whisper, "but never to you." Coraline lifted her eyes, surprised. "What do you mean by that?" "He came back to Wisconsin," Finian replied. "He told me that around 30 he tried to reconnect, but something stopped him. He never said what it was, but he always grew somber when mentioning family. It was as if there was something that held him to the past, but also kept him away from it." Coraline felt a pang in her chest. The idea that Anthony might have tried to return but was prevented was as comforting as it was devastating. "You know more than you're telling me, don't you?" she said, looking at Finian with eyes that seemed to pierce his soul. Finian looked away, nervously clasping his hands. "I know some things, but I'm not sure if you're ready to hear everything." "I've spent years trying to understand what happened to my son," Coraline said, her voice hardening. "If there's something I need to know, boy, now is the time." Finian hesitated again, but finally relented. "I think there was something involving money. My dad mentioned once that there was a conflict over inheritance, but he never gave the details." Coraline froze. She knew exactly what Finian was talking about, but she didn't want to believe it. "Inheritance," she repeated, the word bitter in her mouth. "Yes," Finian continued. "I don't know exactly how, but he seemed hurt, as if he had been betrayed by someone close." Coraline felt as if the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. There was more to this story than she had ever known. And for the first time in years, she found herself confronted with the possibility that Anthony's departure hadn't been merely a matter of youthful rebellion. "There are things you still haven't told me," she said to Finian, her voice now cold and controlled. "And I won't rest until I know the whole truth." Finian nodded, but the expression on his face showed he was also fighting his own demons. "I just want to find answers, Mrs. Coraline, for me and for you, and maybe for my dad too." The silence that followed was heavy but full of meaning. Coraline knew that the path ahead would be painful, but for the first time in decades, she felt there might be a chance to find some sort of peace. She looked at Finian, her eyes now shining with renewed determination. "If we're going to do this, we need to do it right. No secrets, no half-truths. Do you agree?" "I agree," Finian replied, his voice firm. And with that, Coraline Trask began to confront the shadows of the past that had haunted her for so long. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video and leave a comment. It really helps the channel grow and bring more stories like this. Now let's continue with the next chapter. Coraline Trask woke up to the sound of voices in the hallway. A heated, muffled exchange drifted into her room, enough to make her eyes flutter open and her brows furrow. It was early. The day had barely begun, but the familiar, deep tone of Finian mixed with the firm, professional cadence of Rita, the nurse, suggested that something unusual was happening. "He can't just show up here every day." Rita's voice was louder than usual, laced with frustration. "I'm not trying to cause trouble," Finian replied, his voice tense yet controlled. "I'm just trying to get to know her." Coraline sighed, feeling the weight of the morning settle on her shoulders before she even got out of bed. Finian's insistence had turned the past few days into an emotional roller coaster that she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "Rita!" Coraline called from the room, her voice cutting through the discussion outside. The door opened slowly and Rita stepped in, her face a mask of professionalism that barely concealed her irritation. Finian followed, carrying his backpack and wearing a slightly guilty expression. "It's okay, Rita," Coraline said, gesturing for both of them to come in. "If he's here, he must have something important to say, and I'd like to hear it." Rita pressed her lips together, hesitating for a moment before crossing her arms and leaning against the wall. Finian placed his backpack on the floor and sat in the chair next to Coraline's bed. "I brought you something," he began, pulling a small weathered wooden frame from his backpack. He handed it to Coraline, who took the object with careful fingers. It was a photograph. Anthony, still young, wore a shy smile while holding an acoustic guitar. Next to him was a blonde woman with short hair and bright eyes, leaning over the instrument as if teaching him something. Coraline felt a pang in her chest as she recognized the scene. "This photo was taken when my dad was starting to play in local bands," Finian explained. "He told me this woman was his teacher. They became friends, almost like a second family to him." "I didn't know that," Coraline said, her voice low. "That's what I'm talking about," Finian continued, leaning slightly forward. "There are so many things about my dad that you don't know. But that's not your fault. You two were separated by something bigger than he could handle, and I want to understand what it was." Coraline studied the photograph for a few more seconds before handing it back to Finian. "You're determined, aren't you?" she said, a hint of exasperation in her tone. "I am," he replied firmly. Rita, who had remained silent until then, finally intervened. "But why, Finian? Why now? Don't you think this woman has been through enough? She's finally found some peace here and you're reopening wounds that may never heal." "I don't want to hurt her," Finian said, turning to Rita. "But this isn't just about her. It's about all of us. My family was torn apart and I believe she's the only person who can help me understand what happened." "And do you really think you'll find answers here?" Rita crossed her arms, clearly skeptical. "I don't know," Finian admitted, his expression softening, "but I have to try." Coraline watched the young man closely, trying to determine if he was as sincere as he seemed. There was something in his determination that disarmed her, but it also made her suspicious. She knew that no one pursued answers with such passion without carrying their own hidden motivations. "You still haven't told me everything, Finian," she said finally, "and until you're completely honest with me, I can't promise that I'll help you." Finian looked away, his discomfort evident. Rita noticed and took the opportunity to press him further. "You're right, Mrs. Coraline," Rita said, fixing Finian with a sharp look. "He's not being truthful, and I won't stand by and watch you be manipulated." "I'm not manipulating anyone," Finian retorted, his voice rising for the first time. I just don't know how to say what I need to say." Coraline raised a hand, asking for silence. "Then find a way," she said, "because I don't have time for games, Finian." There was a moment of tense silence before Finian finally spoke. "Okay," he said, taking a deep breath. "I'll tell you, but I need you to listen to me until the end." Coraline nodded, her eyes fixed on the young man before her. Rita, though reluctant, also remained silent. My dad, he told me some things before he died. He said there was a fight in the family. Something about money, an inheritance. Finian hesitated, as if the words were difficult to pronounce. He said that fight destroyed everything, that no one came out unscathed. Coraline felt as if the air had been sucked out of the room. The mention of the inheritance brought back painful memories she had buried long ago. Did he say anything about who was involved? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Finian shook his head. He didn't give many details, just said it was something ugly and that he never managed to get over it. Rita watched Coraline closely, noticing the change in her expression. You know what he's talking about, don't you? Coraline closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. I do, she said finally, but I can't say that I fully understand. There are so many things I didn't know at the time, and it seems there's still more I don't know now. Finian leaned forward, his expression full of urgency. Please, Miss Coraline, if there's anything you can tell me, anything at all, I need to know. Coraline opened her eyes and looked at him, her expression serious. You're getting into something that could be much bigger than you realize, young man. But if you're determined to move forward, you'll need to be prepared for what you might find, because believe me, it won't be easy. Finian nodded, his determination unshakable. I'm ready. Coraline turned her attention to Rita, who seemed poised to protest but ultimately relented, letting out a resigned sigh. Whatever you both decide to do, just remember that I'm here to help. But I'll say one thing, Finian. If I find out you're lying or hiding something, I'll throw you out myself. I understand, Finian replied with a slight nod. Coraline focused back on the young man. So let's start from the beginning. Tell me everything you know about this fight, and I'll share what I can remember. Finian began to speak, his words filling the silence of the room as Coraline listened intently. There was something deeply unsettling about how the fragments of their stories seemed to fit together, like pieces of a puzzle that still lacked many components. And as the details started to emerge, Coraline couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the brink of discovering something that would change everything she thought she knew about her family and herself. Coraline Trask woke up before dawn, her heart restless and her thoughts in turmoil. The night had been long, filled with disjointed dreams where voices from the past echoed in disturbingly vivid ways. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she felt the weight of the decades she carried. Finian had brought to the surface a dormant pain, one she had carefully guarded for years. Now, like a cracked glass about to shatter, Coraline knew it was inevitable to confront it head-on. The asylum was silent, except for the muffled sound of occasional footsteps in the hallway. Coraline struggled to her feet and made her way to the dresser, opening the bottom drawer with trembling hands. Inside, there was an old wooden box, worn by time. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up, her fingers tracing the surface as if trying to read the past etched there. When she opened the lid, the familiar smell of aged paper enveloped her. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings, and at the bottom a black leather diary. Coraline picked it up, feeling a wave of emotions as her fingers glided over the cover. This diary hadn't seen the light of day in decades, but she knew it contained the truth that Finian, and perhaps she herself, were searching for. Sitting back on the bed, Coraline opened the diary. The first page bore her own handwriting, dated 1967, a year before Anthony left home. The words in the diary were a raw reflection of the time. Coraline began to read, each sentence bringing back memories she would rather forget. Malcolm doesn't understand how much Anthony needs space. We argued again today about music lessons. He thinks it's a waste of time, but I see how much it means to Anthony. He has so much talent, so much passion. I just wish Malcolm could see that. The words were like a mirror, reflecting the constant tension between her and Malcolm. Coraline remembered the fights that seemed endless, each one a little more intense than the last. Anthony always stood in the middle, trying to justify his dreams to a father who only saw responsibility and obligation. But as Coraline moved through the pages, She realized the diary revealed more than just family conflicts. It also mentioned regular visits from a distant relative, Arthur Trask, Malcolm's brother. Arthur was a charismatic and ambitious man, and his presence in the Trask household was never entirely comfortable. "Arthur came over tonight," Coraline read. "He brought a proposal for Malcolm, something about their father's inheritance. I don't like the tone of Arthur. There's something about him that makes me uncomfortable. But Malcolm seems willing to listen." Coraline vaguely remembered those visits, but reading about them now brought a renewed discomfort. Arthur always had an air of manipulation, and she had never fully trusted him. However, Malcolm, eager to improve the family's life, seemed willing to ignore Coraline's instincts. As Coraline was absorbed in the diary, a soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. It was Finian, holding 2 cups of coffee. "I brought this for you," he said, entering without waiting for a formal invitation. Coraline closed the diary, placing it aside. "You have a knack for showing up at just the right moments, don't you?" Finian smiled shyly, setting one of the cups on the table beside her. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay after yesterday." "After yesterday, you left me with more questions than answers," Coraline retorted, picking up the cup and blowing on the hot coffee. "And I'm starting to think you know more than you're letting on." Finian sat in the chair next to the bed, his smile fading. "I know it seems like I'm hiding things, but the truth is I don't have all the answers either. I'm trying to figure out what happened just as much as you are." Coraline leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Finian. "You mentioned yesterday that your coming here has something to do with documents. What documents are those?" Finian hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "I overheard my father talking about a will, something that caused a huge fight in the family. He never told me the details, but I know it involved Arthur Trask, and he mentioned you as someone who might know more." "Arthur," Coraline repeated, almost spitting the name. She felt a wave of anger wash over her at the mention of her brother-in-law, a man who had brought so much chaos to her family. "You knew he was involved, didn't you?" Finian asked. "I suspected," Coraline admitted, gripping the cup in her hands. "Arthur was always shrewd, always had a plan up his sleeve. He convinced Malcolm to sign some papers, saying they were to protect the inheritance. But I knew there was more to it. Malcolm never wanted to hear my warnings, and when everything fell apart, it was the beginning of the end for our family." "Do you think those papers still exist?" Finian asked, hope evident in his voice. "If they exist, they're hidden somewhere in the old house," Coraline replied, thoughtful. "But delving into that past won't be easy, Finian. There's more pain there than you can imagine." Determined to confront the shadows of the past, Coraline opened the diary again, this time with Finian by her side. She showed him the pages that mentioned Arthur and his suspicious proposals. "He tried to buy Malcolm's silence," Coraline explained. "Said he would divide the inheritance equally, but I knew he was lying. By the time I finally understood what was happening, it was too late." Finian looked at the pages of the diary, absorbing every word. "And do you think my father knew about this?" "I don't know," Coraline admitted. "But if he did, that explains why he distanced himself. Maybe he discovered something he couldn't bear." "Then we need to find those documents," Finian said, determination etched on his face. "They might hold the answers we're looking for." Coraline looked at him, a mixture of fear and resignation in her eyes. "Are you ready for this, kid? Because the truth might be harder to bear than the mystery." Finian nodded, his expression resolute. "Whatever it is, we need to know." And with that, Coraline and Finian decided it was time to revisit the place where it all began, fully aware that the answers they sought could bring more questions and pain than they had imagined. Coraline stood next to her dresser, her eyes fixed on the bottom of the open drawer. Her hands trembled slightly as she rummaged through the contents, pulling out folded papers and old boxes, all carefully kept but long forgotten. She was searching for something concrete, something that could confirm or deny the vague memories stirred by the diary. Finian, sitting in a nearby chair, watched in silence. He seemed eager to help, but he knew that any hasty word could make Coraline shut down. I was sure they were here, Coraline said, more to herself than to Finian. Those letters, there was a large envelope, maybe even a folder, with everything important in it. Can I help you look? Finian asked hesitantly. Coraline paused for a moment, considering. There was something about the boy that inspired cautious trust, but she still wasn't sure if she could fully share her secrets with him. Finally, she sighed and waved her hand. Grab that box over there, she said, pointing to a pile in the corner of the room. Finian immediately complied, kneeling beside the pile and lifting the lid of the indicated box. Inside was a mix of photo albums, old documents and newspaper clippings. He began to carefully sift through the items, pulling things out and setting them aside, hoping to find something significant. As Finian rummaged, Coraline pulled out a yellowed envelope from the drawer and opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter in Malcolm's familiar handwriting. She read it silently, feeling a pang of emotion as she recalled his words. Coraline, I know you don't trust Arthur, but I believe he can help us improve our situation. We can't continue living like this. Anthony needs opportunities that I can't provide. He's a good man, even if you can't see it. Coraline closed her eyes, feeling the weight of guilt and frustration. She had always known Arthur was untrustworthy, but Malcolm had been desperate to improve the family's life. At the time, she had chosen to remain silent, thinking she could handle the consequences later. Now, decades later, those decisions felt even heavier. I found something, Finian said, interrupting her thoughts. Coraline turned and saw him holding a photograph. She recognized the image immediately. Malcolm and Arthur standing in front of a table, both smiling, with Anthony in the background, looking down at the floor. This was taken shortly before Anthony left, Coraline said, taking the photo and analyzing every detail. It was one of those days when everything felt wrong, even though no one said anything. Finian studied her expression. Do you think there's something hidden from that time? Something that explains what happened later? Coraline hesitated. Maybe, but we need more than photos to understand. If I could find those letters, the documents, maybe we could piece things together. As Coraline and Finian continued their search, Rita appeared in the doorway. Her eyes narrowed with concern. Are you okay, Miss Coraline? She asked, stepping in without waiting for a response. I'm fine, Coraline replied quickly, but Rita was already taking in the scene, the open dresser, the boxes scattered across the floor, and Finian kneeling among the elderly woman's belongings. And what is he doing? Rita asked, her tone clearly skeptical. He's helping me, Coraline said, raising her chin. We're trying to find some old things that might clarify what happened with my family. Rita crossed her arms, clearly dissatisfied. Miss Coraline, with all due respect, do you think it's a good idea to trust someone you barely know? He showed up out of nowhere, claiming to be your grandson, and now he's rummaging through your things. Rummaging? Finian stood up, offended. I'm not rummaging. I'm trying to help her understand her past. And for your information, I really am her grandson. That's what you say, Rita shot back with a sharp tone, but you haven't presented anything to prove it. Enough, Coraline exclaimed, her voice loud and authoritative, cutting through the argument. I'm not a child, Rita. I know exactly what I'm doing, and if I've decided to let Finian help me, that's my choice. Rita fell silent for a moment, surprised by Coraline's firmness. Finally, she sighed and nodded, though concern still lingered on her face. All right, she said, but if you need anything, I'll be here. With that, Rita left, closing the door behind her. Finian let out a sigh of relief and returned to rummaging through the box, but Coraline sensed that something had changed. Rita was right to be worried, and Coraline couldn't ignore the fact that she was placing a great deal of trust in someone who had, until recently, been a stranger. She's just looking out for me, Coraline said softly. Don't take it personally. I understand, Finian replied, not looking at her. But I'm telling the truth, and I'll prove it to her, to you, to everyone. After hours of searching, Coraline finally found what she had been looking for. At the bottom of a box there was a large folder, its edges crumpled, and an old elastic band keeping it closed. "This is it," she said, holding the folder carefully. Finian sat beside her, watching as Coraline opened it. Inside was a collection of documents, deeds, receipts, and handwritten letters. Coraline began to flip through them, her eyes scanning the words with a mix of curiosity and dread. One of the letters caught her attention. It was from Arthur, written in his confident, slanted handwriting. "Malcolm, I'm sending this letter to confirm our agreement. Once the papers are signed, the inheritance will be divided as we discussed. I'm sure this decision will be best for all of us, especially for Anthony. He deserves a better future, away from the financial problems we face." Coraline pressed her lips together, anger rising within her. "He lied," she said in a low voice. "Arthur promised to help, but he was just ensuring he got everything for himself." Finian took the letter and read it in silence. "That explains why my father was so bitter," he said. "He must have found out what happened." "And he never told me," Coraline said, sorrow evident in her voice. "He must have thought I was part of it, that I knew." Finian set the letter aside and took Coraline's hand. "But you didn't know. And now we have the chance to clarify everything. Maybe even to clear your family's name." Coraline looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. "And what if we discover something worse? Something I'm not ready to face?" "Then we'll face it together," Finian said with a firmness that surprised her. Coraline took a deep breath, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. She knew there were more secrets hidden in the documents, but with Finian by her side, she felt strong enough to continue. "Let's start unraveling this," she said, "but I want you to promise me something." "Anything," Finian replied. "Be honest with me, always, no secrets, no omissions." Finian nodded. "I promise." And with that, Coraline and Finian dove into the past together, ready to confront the truths that had been buried for so long. The sun had barely risen on the horizon when Coraline Trask heard a discreet knock at her door. Already awake, sitting in her rocking chair, she had been expecting it to be Rita, concerned about the events of the last few days. But when she opened the door, she found Finian standing there. He looked exhausted, his face pale and his eyes red, as if he hadn't slept at all. "You look worse than I do," Coraline said, arching an eyebrow. Finian let out a nervous laugh and entered without an invitation. "We need to talk. I can't put this off any longer." Coraline noticed the seriousness in his voice and closed the door. He sat on the bed, anxiously rubbing his hands together, while Coraline waited in silence. "Yesterday, after I found that letter," Finian began, "I received a call. It was from someone in Arthur's family." Coraline froze. The name Arthur was like a ghost haunting her, especially after everything she had recently discovered. "Who called you?" she asked, her voice steady. "A distant cousin. Someone I barely know," Finian explained. "But what he said was clear. I should stop looking. He said it would only bring trouble for me and for you." Coraline crossed her arms. "And why does he think I'm involved in this?" "Because you're the only living person who can explain what happened," Finian replied, his eyes locked on hers. "He said you know more than you're telling, that you're the only one who can resolve this." Coraline felt the weight of his words. She knew there were missing pieces in the puzzle, but now it seemed she herself might be one of those pieces. The idea of being at the center of a conflict she barely understood was both terrifying and exasperating. "Are these threats serious?" Coraline asked. Finian nodded slowly. "Yes, he mentioned that there are people willing to do anything to keep this matter buried." "And you're still here digging into what you shouldn't," Coraline said, looking at him with a mix of disbelief and admiration. "Because I believe the truth needs to come out," Finian replied without hesitation. "And you believe that too, Miss Coraline. I see it in your eyes." She didn't respond immediately, but felt a warmth in her chest. Finian was reckless, but there was an honesty in him that was hard to ignore. Later that morning, Coraline took the folder she had found the day before and began revisiting the documents. Finian sat beside her, both of them immersed in the old papers, trying to find any clue that would explain the chaos. Suddenly, Coraline stopped, holding up a yellowed piece of paper. Her eyes widened as she read it. "It's the will," she murmured, as if she couldn't believe it. "What?" Finian leaned in closer, looking at the document. Coraline pointed to the heading. It was a will dated 1965, with Malcolm Trask's name in bold letters. Further down, there was a list of beneficiaries, including her, Anthony, and Arthur. "I thought this had disappeared," Coraline said, still in shock. "After Malcolm died, Arthur took over everything. He said the documents had been lost, that there was nothing to be done." Finian took the will, reading quickly. "But it's clear here that you and Anthony were the primary heirs. Arthur would only get a small portion." "Exactly," Coraline replied. "That explains why he was so determined to take control. He knew that if this will came to light, he would lose everything." Finian fell silent for a moment, processing the information. "This could be the missing piece," he finally said. "If we can prove this will is legitimate, maybe we can understand why everything happened." "And maybe put an end to this story," Coraline added, although she knew things would hardly be that simple. As the day went on, Coraline grew increasingly restless. There was something inside her that wouldn't let her rest. Finally, as evening approached, she made a decision. "Finian," she said as he organized the documents they had found, "I need to go back to my old house." Finian looked up, surprised. "Leave the asylum? Are you sure?" "I am," she replied firmly. "If there are answers to be found, that's where they are. This is my last chance to confront all of this." "I'll go with you," Finian said without hesitation. Coraline smiled slightly. "I was hoping you'd say that." When Rita learned of the decision, she reacted with concern but also with respect for Coraline's determination. "If this is what you need to do, Miss Coraline, I'll be here when you return. But please, be careful." "I will," Coraline assured her, even though she felt she was embarking on something greater than anything she could foresee. In the car, as they drove to the old house, Coraline looked out the window, watching the familiar streets pass by like flashes of memory. It was strange to return to a place she had left behind so long ago, but at the same time, it felt inevitable. "Do you think you'll find what you're looking for?" Finian asked, breaking the silence. "I don't know," Coraline admitted, "but if we don't try, we'll never know." As the house finally came into view, Coraline felt her heart race. She had no idea what awaited her inside, but she knew she couldn't turn back now. Thank you for following along. If you're invested in this journey, make sure to subscribe, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments. It's crucial for supporting the channel. Let's dive back into the story. Coraline Trask's old house was shrouded in shadows as she and Finian arrived. The afternoon sun began to hide behind the trees surrounding the property, casting an even more melancholic air over the place. For Coraline, it felt like stepping into a portal to a time she had spent decades trying to forget. The sound of her footsteps on the gravel path echoed like a ghost in her ears. "It's bigger than I imagined," Finian said, gazing at the weathered facade. "It was a home," Coraline replied, her voice heavy with emotion. She unlocked the door with a rusty key she had kept since the day she left the house. The creaking of the hinges sounded like a scream in the afternoon silence. Upon entering, Coraline was hit by the familiar smell of aged wood and dust, which seemed to carry memories in every particle. Finian observed everything intently, following Coraline as she walked through the living room. Pictures still hung on the walls, and furniture covered with white sheets gave the place an air of abandonment. Coraline stopped in front of a table by the fireplace, her fingers gliding over the now rough surface. "It's here," she said, pointing to a locked drawer. Finian didn't question how she knew this. There was a determination in her voice that he wouldn't dare challenge. He found a small, rusty key on the table and handed it to Coraline. She slowly opened the drawer, revealing a pile of yellowed papers and a small black-covered book. "These documents," Coraline murmured as she began to flip through them. Finian picked up one of the papers, examining it under the dim light coming through the window. "Here it is," he said, holding up a signed contract. "It's an agreement between Malcolm and Arthur. It looks like your husband transferred most of the control of the inheritance to his brother." Coraline took the contract, her eyes fixed on the words as she tried to absorb what she saw. "He must have been deceived," she said, her voice trembling. "Malcolm would never do this on his own. Arthur was manipulative. He always knew how to bend people to his will." As Coraline continued sifting through the papers, she found another letter, this time addressed to Anthony. The handwriting was familiar, and her heart sank as she recognized it as Arthur's. "Anthony, you don't understand the responsibilities that come with this inheritance. Your father knew this and entrusted me to take care of things. If you keep questioning the decisions that have been made, you will have no place in this family. Think carefully before you act." Coraline let the letter fall to the floor, shocked. Finian picked it up and read it, his expression darkening. "He tried to silence my father," Finian said, filled with anger. "And it seems he succeeded. This explains why he never spoke about these things with me. He must have carried that guilt alone." As they continued to search the house, Finian began to speak about his own struggles. It was clear he carried something heavy inside him, something that needed to be said. "Miss Coraline," he began, stopping in the middle of the hallway, "I haven't been completely honest with you." Coraline turned to him, frowning. "What do you mean?" "Before I came here, I received more than just a call from a relative," he confessed. "I received direct threats. They said that if I kept digging into the past, there would be consequences, and it wouldn't be just for me, but for you as well." Coraline felt a chill run down her spine. "And you didn't think you should tell me this sooner?" "I didn't want to scare you," Finian said with a sigh. "But the more I found out about what happened, the more I knew I needed to come here. You have the right to know the truth, and honestly, I needed answers just as much as you did." Coraline shook her head, absorbing his words. "These people, they won't stop, will they?" "No," Finian replied sincerely. "But if we can prove what we've found, we can break the hold they have. We need to expose all of this." As the two continued to rummage through the house, they heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. Coraline went to the window, peering through the dusty curtain. Her heart sank as she recognized the figure getting out of the car. "It's Arthur," she said, feeling a mix of fear and rage. Finian tensed. "He's coming here. How did he know we'd be here?" Coraline had no answer. All she knew was that she was about to confront the man who had destroyed her family. The door swung open abruptly, and Arthur stepped inside, his expression a mask of authority. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. "That should be obvious," Coraline replied, confronting him with a courage she didn't know she had. "We're trying to understand what you did to our family." Arthur let out a bitter laugh. "What I did? Coraline, you've always been good at blaming others for your problems. It was Malcolm who signed the papers. It was Anthony who chose to leave. All I did was try to keep things in order." "Order?" Coraline stepped forward. "You stole the inheritance that should have been shared among us all. You manipulated Malcolm, silenced Anthony, and destroyed everything we had." Arthur narrowed his eyes. "And what are you going to do with that accusation? You have no proof." "But we do," Finian said, raising the contract they had found. "And we won't stop until everyone knows what happened." Arthur moved toward Finian, but Coraline stepped in front of him. "You're not going to touch him," she said with a firmness that surprised even Arthur. "This won't end well for you, Coraline," Arthur said, his tone darker now. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "And perhaps you've underestimated who I am," Coraline replied. For a moment there was only silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Finally Arthur backed down, but his expression made it clear he wasn't giving up. "You will regret this," he said before storming out, slamming the door behind him. As the sound of the car faded away, Coraline let out a deep sigh, as if she had been holding her breath for hours. Finian approached her, gently holding her arm. "You were amazing," he said. Coraline smiled faintly, but there was a glint of worry in her eyes. This is far from over. And if he said we would regret this, we better believe him." "Then we need to be ready," Finian said. Coraline nodded, feeling a renewed determination rise within her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was in control, even though she knew the battle was just beginning. The morning dawned cold and grey, but inside the old Trask house, Coraline and Finian were immersed in papers, letters and documents piling around them. A small desk lamp cast a warm yellow light over the room, highlighting the expressions of concentration and fatigue on their faces. "This is like trying to put together a puzzle with missing pieces," Finian said, leaning back in his chair. He massaged his temples, exhausted after hours of reviewing every detail they found. "At least we have a clearer picture of what Arthur did," Coraline replied, not taking her eyes off a document she held. "Malcolm trusted him too much, and I was so busy trying to protect Anthony that I didn't see what was happening right under my nose." Finian paused for a moment, watching her. Coraline seemed small, but there was an undeniable strength in her, a type of resilience he was only beginning to understand. "You can't blame yourself for that," he said finally. "Arthur manipulated everyone, and even now he's trying to intimidate us." "Intimidate?" Coraline looked at him, her eyes shining with determination. "He thinks he can control the past and the present, but he's mistaken. If there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's that the truth has a way of coming to light, no matter how much you try to bury it." Finian smiled slightly. "You're stronger than I imagined, Miss Coraline." "And you're more stubborn than I thought," she retorted, a touch of humor easing the tension for a moment. As they continued to examine the papers, they found a rudimentary hand-drawn map, with notes that seemed to indicate the location of a safe or hiding place on the property. Coraline felt intrigued, but at the same time something about it made her hesitate. "This looks important," Finian said, turning the paper to study it better. "Maybe Arthur hid something he didn't want anyone to find." "Or maybe it's another trap," Coraline replied, crossing her arms. "With Arthur, you never know." "Either way, we need to find out," Finian said. "This could be our chance to expose everything." They decided to follow the map's instructions, which led them to the house's basement. Coraline hesitated as she descended the stairs, memories of that part of the house bringing back an uncomfortable sensation. When they reached the bottom, they found an old wooden trunk. Finian opened it carefully, revealing a collection of additional papers, some yellowed with age, and a small metal box. Inside the box was a letter. Coraline picked up the envelope with trembling fingers, immediately recognizing the handwriting. "It's from Anthony," she said, almost in a whisper. Finian watched in silence as she opened the letter, pulling out the folded paper. Coraline began to read, her voice trembling as her son's words spoke directly to her heart. "Mom, I know you always tried to protect me, but I need you to know what really happened. Arthur offered me money to leave home. He said I was a burden to the family's future, that it would be better for everyone if I disappeared. I accepted because I thought I was doing the right thing, but I realized too late that he was manipulating everything. I know you did your best. Forgive me for not being strong enough to face this by your side." The letter fell to the ground when Coraline finished reading, tears streaming down her face. Finian knelt beside her, picking up the letter and rereading the words in silence, his expression darkening. "He knew he was being used," Finian said with restrained anger, "and Arthur still managed to make him feel guilty about it." Coraline shook her head, trying to process everything. Anthony was always so sensitive. He thought he was protecting us by leaving, but all he did was destroy himself. As Coraline struggled to hold back tears, Finian placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Maybe it's time to stop looking back with guilt," he said gently. "You did what you could, and now we have the chance to do what Anthony couldn't, confront Arthur and make this right." Coraline looked at him, seeing in his eyes a determination that reflected Anthony's. "Do you really believe we can win?" she asked. "It's not about winning," Finian replied. "It's about putting an end to this for you, for Anthony, and maybe even for me." She smiled faintly, feeling a stronger connection to Finian than she ever had before. For the first time, she saw him not just as a young man seeking answers, but as someone genuinely dedicated to restoring what had been destroyed. "You're a lot like him," Coraline said, her voice soft. "Like Anthony?" Finian asked, surprised. She nodded. The same stubbornness, the same courage, and if he had had more time, I think he would have been a good man, just like you. Finian didn't know what to say. He simply smiled, feeling a wave of pride and emotion at her words. Throughout the day, Coraline and Finian continued to work together, organizing documents and plotting a plan. They knew that facing Arthur directly would be risky, but they also knew there was no other choice. As they reviewed the papers, Coraline found another envelope hidden between the pages of a book. Inside was a deed, signed, indicating that most of the Trask property had been transferred to Arthur's name irregularly. "This is proof that he acted illegally," Finian said, examining the document. "But will it be enough to stop him?" Coraline asked. "Maybe not on its own," Finian replied. "But combined with everything we found, it's enough to put him on the defensive." Coraline nodded, feeling a renewed determination. She knew the path ahead would be difficult, but she also knew she was no longer alone. With Finian by her side, she felt ready to face anything. Coraline Trask felt the weight of decades of silence and suffering as she made her way to the office where Arthur was waiting for her. Her footsteps echoed down the hall of the old building, each click of her shoes on the wooden floor resonating as a reminder of her determination. Beside her, Finian stood firm, holding the folder containing the documents they had gathered. He knew this moment would be decisive. When they reached the door, Coraline paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. "Ready?" Finian asked, his eyes searching for any sign of hesitation in her. "Ready," Coraline replied, with a firmness that surprised even herself. They entered. Arthur was seated behind a large mahogany desk, his expression a mask of calculated control. Beside him were two other relatives, both with cold, calculating looks. The tension in the room was palpable. "So, you finally decided to face the truth, Coraline?" Arthur said, his tone almost sarcastic. "No," Coraline replied, placing her bag on the desk with a deliberate motion. "I've come to expose the truth, Arthur, and you know exactly what that means." Finian opened the folder and began to spread the documents across the table. The contract, the original will, the letters, every piece of the puzzle they had assembled was right there. Arthur looked at the papers, his expression hardening. "This is a dangerous game, Coraline," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You've played this game for far too long," Coraline shot back, unflinching. "You manipulated Malcolm, you drove Anthony away, and you destroyed what should have been a legacy for all of us." "You don't understand," Arthur countered, leaning forward. "I did what was necessary to keep this family together. Malcolm trusted me because he knew you and Anthony didn't have the stomach for the hard decisions." "Hard decisions?" Coraline laughed, but the sound was bitter. "You call stealing and betraying hard decisions? You've destroyed lives, Arthur." As the argument escalated, one of the relatives next to Arthur began to sift through the documents. It was clear that some of the evidence unsettled him. "Arthur," he said, lowering his voice, "these documents, they're legitimate. This could ruin us all." Arthur ignored the warning, focusing on Coraline. "And what do you intend to do with this?" he asked. "Take it to court? Further tarnish the family name?" "I intend to seek justice," Coraline replied. "I won't allow you to continue controlling everything at the expense of lies and suffering." Before Arthur could respond, Finian intervened, "And that includes relinquishing something I'm entitled to as well." All eyes turned to Finian. He placed his hand on the papers and looked directly at Arthur. "I don't want any of this inheritance," he said, his voice clear and firm. "All I want is for the truth to be recognized and for my grandmother to finally have peace." Coraline looked at him, surprised and moved. "Finian, you don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling. "I do, yes," he replied, not breaking eye contact with Arthur. "Because this has never been about money for me. It's about doing what's right." The silence that followed was broken when Arthur let out a dry laugh. So you think you're doing something noble, that this will fix everything? No, Coraline replied firmly, but it's a start, and you can no longer hide what you've done. Arthur scoffed, but before he could say more, Coraline placed an envelope on the table. There's one more thing you need to know, she said, looking directly at Finian. It's about you, Finian, and about Anthony. Finian frowned, confused. What do you mean? When Anthony left, Coraline began, her voice heavy with emotion, it wasn't just because Arthur forced him out. I also played a part in that. Finian fell silent, waiting for her to continue. I didn't defend him, Coraline admitted, tears beginning to stream down her face. I knew what Arthur was doing, but I froze. I thought that if Anthony left, he would be safer. But that only made him more vulnerable. He never trusted me again. Finian felt a wave of emotion wash over him. And why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know, Coraline answered, and because I don't want to make the same mistake with you. Finian took a deep breath, absorbing her words. He knew that this confession was not easy for Coraline, and while he felt a deep pain hearing it, he also felt something else, a renewed connection, a mutual understanding. Arthur, who had remained silent during Coraline's confession, finally spoke. Does this change anything? He asked with disdain. Yes, Coraline replied, looking at him with renewed strength. This changes everything, because now, no matter what happens, I'm no longer afraid of you. Arthur realized he had lost control of the situation. He looked at the other relatives in the room, seeking support, but found only looks of doubt and distrust. This isn't over, he said, rising from his chair. No, not yet, Coraline replied, but it's starting to end. As Arthur left the room, Coraline felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She looked at Finian, who was still processing everything that had happened. Thank you, she said finally. Why? He asked, surprised. For reminding me of who I am, Coraline replied. Finian smiled, feeling closer to her than ever. And for the first time in a long while, Coraline felt hope, a hope that despite everything, her family might still find a way back to one another. The sun rose lazily in the sky, spreading soft hues of gold and pink through the trees surrounding the nursing home. Coraline Trask stepped slowly out of the car, with Finian by her side. Her steps felt lighter than in recent weeks, as if the resolution of their family conflict had restored some of her lost strength. She looked at the nursing home, its worn yet familiar walls, and felt a strange comfort. It was good to be back, but better still was the knowledge that she was not alone. Are you sure you're okay staying here? Finian asked, holding the door open for her. It's more than enough, Coraline replied, a smile that carried years of stories blooming on her face. This place gave me the space I needed to think, and now I can do something good for it. Finian watched her with admiration. In recent days, he had seen his grandmother confront the ghosts of her past with a bravery that deeply inspired him. He had promised to stand by her, and now that the burden of their inheritance was shared, he felt that they could truly begin to rebuild what had been lost. Inside the nursing home, the nurses greeted Coraline warmly, happy to see her return. Rita, with a friendly smile, approached to help. Welcome back, Mrs. Coraline, she said, gently holding the older woman's arm. I hope you've resolved what you needed. More than I could have imagined, Coraline replied, squeezing Rita's hand. Finian, watching closely, chimed in with a casual tone. Don't worry, Rita. I'm here to make sure she doesn't cause any trouble. Rita laughed, but the look she gave Coraline was full of affection. Their relationship had changed, evolving from mere patient and caregiver to something deeper, a connection based on mutual respect. In the days that followed, Finian began visiting Coraline regularly. He brought news of the progress on the donation they had decided to make with part of the inheritance. Coraline had insisted that a significant portion be allocated for improvements to the nursing home and the creation of programs to help other families. It's not enough just to undo the mistakes of the past, she told Finian. We need to create something that lasts, something that touches lives beyond our own. The first major renovation was in the nursing home's garden. Coraline had always commented on how small and uninviting the space was for the residents. Finian personally oversaw the construction of a new garden, complete with benches, colorful flowers, and a small, charming fountain. On the day of the inauguration, Coraline watched, emotional, as the residents explored the space with smiles on their faces. "You did a great job, Finian," she said, holding her grandson's arm as they walked through the garden. "You taught me what needed to be done," he replied with a smile. As they strolled, a group of children ran past. They were the children of the nursing home staff, who now had a safe and beautiful place to play while their parents worked. Coraline watched the children with a peaceful expression. "Anthony loved gardens," she remarked, breaking the silence. Finian said nothing but gently squeezed her arm. He knew how much that moment meant to Coraline. Years passed like a gentle breeze turning into a wind. Coraline aged, and her body began to show the inevitable signs of time. Finian continued to visit her, now accompanied by his wife and later by his children. Coraline welcomed them with the same energy as always, even as her strength began to wane. On one of her last birthdays, Finian brought a special gift. A framed photo of the nursing home garden, now in full bloom, with children playing in the background. Coraline looked at the photo for a long time, her eyes shining with tears of emotion. "You transformed something so painful into something so beautiful," she said, her voice choked. "This is more than I could have ever hoped for." Finian held her hand. "I just followed what you started, Grandma. You were the true inspiration." Eventually, Coraline passed away. Her farewell was serene, surrounded by the family she had helped to rebuild. Finian held her hand until the very end, feeling grateful for everything she had taught him. After the funeral, he returned home and began organizing Coraline's things. Among her belongings, he found an envelope addressed to him in her handwriting. Inside was a letter, and as he read it, Finian felt his heart tighten. "Finian, if you are reading this, it means my journey has come to an end. I want you to know that you were the best part of my last years. Through you, I found strengths I thought I had lost and regained faith in family that I believed was forever broken. You are a reflection of the best of us, and I hope you continue to carry that with you. With eternal love, Coraline." Finian closed his eyes for a moment, allowing the tears to fall freely. He carefully tucked the letter away and picked up a recent photo from the nearby table, a photo of his family. He, his wife, and their children, all smiling together in the same garden that Coraline had helped to create. "Thank you, Grandma," he said quietly, looking at the photo, "for everything." He placed the photo next to the letter and looked out the window, watching the wind sway the trees in his backyard. Even without Coraline there, he knew her legacy would live on in every choice he made, in every moment he cherished with his own family. It was the end of one story, but also the beginning of another, built on love, forgiveness, and the strength of bonds that, though they may be broken, can always be restored. The story reminds us of the strength and resilience of family bonds, even when shattered by time, misunderstandings, and pain. It's a testament to how confronting the past can lead to healing and renewal, not just for ourselves, but for the generations that follow. This journey of rediscovery, forgiveness, and legacy shows us that it's never too late to find closure and purpose. What about you? What would you do if faced with a long-lost family member, a forgotten secret, or a chance to rebuild what seemed broken forever? And most importantly, what did you think of this emotional story? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming stories. Give this video a like and share your reflections in the comments below. And don't stop here. Click the card on the screen to watch another compelling story you'll absolutely love. Thank you for watching and being part of our community. We truly appreciate you.